In this lecture, we'll focus on existentialism as one of the earliest and clearest indications of the adaptive survival response triggered in Western cultural identity by the eruption of totalitarianism, as we've viewed it in previous lectures. Our attention will be focused on the call of existentialism for total responsibility. Total responsibility on the part of human freedom for its own identity as the only adequate response to the forces of totalitarianism in the 20th century. Now, let's pause for a moment and resituate ourselves in the development that we've been following. We've seen how the outbreak of World War brought about the realistic possibility of the death of history through a violence which was capable not just of killing vast numbers of people, but of violating humanity as a whole. It's significant that it's precisely at this time that the issue arises for the first time in the history of Western civilization of the possibility of crimes against humanity itself. Think of what that means. Crimes against individual people we understand readily. How is it possible to commit a crime against humanity itself? It cannot be a question just of numbers, of quantities of dead, but of a level of violence and a threat of death that goes to the very core of humanity, as we've discussed it, to the human imagination, so that it becomes possible to imagine for the first time the death of humanity and the obliteration of its meaning. As a response to the threat of total war, the emphasis on the singular existing individual that we've seen already in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Dostoevsky undergoes a radical mutation to emerge in the 1940s and the 1950s in France under the guise of French existentialism. Now, existentialism is an extremely, notoriously imprecise term, and it can be as misleading as it is useful. Even a limited association, such as shall be made in this lecture and the next lecture, among three French thinkers, Sartre, Beauvoir, and Camus, would be disputed by the protagonists themselves. They would say, no, we're not all in the same basket. We're not all simply existentialists. Nevertheless, since neither the unique identity or individuality of these three highly original thinkers, nor the overall character of the existentialist episode as a whole is our primary concern here, I think it's reasonable for us, and we can safely focus on how they all manifest one shared adaptive trait in the evolutionary development of heroic identity, because that's what we're concerned with here. The existentialists, in our view, are going to appear as successors in the generations of heroic identity, a particular form of heroic identity which emerges precisely in response to the situation of total war and attempts to face that situation with a concept of total responsibility, an insistence on taking total responsibility for one's own personal identity as the only possible authentic response for human existence in its search for meaning in the midst of a world which threatens the extinction of the very possibility of meaning. So, we shall characterize these three thinkers as proposing the most radical form of heroism we've yet encountered, as the most basic characteristic of human existence. Keep in mind here, we've already established that our guiding path is shaped by two optics. the metaphoric optic of the hero and that of the saint. Two possible ways, two sets of eyes for looking at reality and in seeing our situation, searching in that situation for a sense of meaning and a sense of identity that can sustain both our life and our awareness of the necessity of death. This existentialist form of heroism posits that to be a person is nothing. We'll come back to the importance of that word nothingness for Sartre in just a bit. But to be a person is nothing but to be in search of a way of giving meaning to one's life lived as a kind of project for which one bears sole responsibility, with no hope of appeal to any higher authority or to the solidarity of any human community. And to live that life project with the urgency of an immediate awareness of the necessity of death. For the existentialists, to be a hero, in other words, is to live with no excuses for one's freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre is, of course, the most influential figure for the popular conception of existentialism. He was most directly responsible for giving the existentialist movement in the 20th century its primarily countercultural image. Sartre's early work prior to and during the Second World War, especially his novels like Nausea, published in 1934, and plays like No Exit, 1945, and The Flies, 1943, together with his more strictly philosophical works like The Transcendence of the Ego in 1937 and Being and Nothingness in 1943, together present an undeniably bleak and isolated image of human existence, characterized by total resistance to everything which is other than the self. Now, we've already suggested that what we're dealing with in these 20th century images of heroism, which we're considering now, and of saintliness in lectures to come, are these two metaphors pushed to their absolute extremity. And it is the peculiarness, the bizarreness, the bleakness, the desolation of these extremities that people so often find off-putting. Off-putting in a way that, unfortunately, the testimony, the human testimony that stands behind them can be ignored, can be too easily dismissed as, well, as we said, extreme, as somehow or other not human. And yet, it is precisely the question, what does it mean to be human? And even more basically, does it mean anything that is at stake here? That is freedom, to be able to ask that question. And precisely what Sartre and the existentialist is calling for is that total responsibility to ask the whole question of meaning. So, before considering the Sartrean conception of the self in its specific details, we want to give Sartre a context in which the bleakness, peculiarness, and extremity of his worldview might make just a bit more sense. So it'll be helpful to notice the way in which Sartre's views correspond closely to the worldview, lo and behold, of quantum mechanics, which we examined in the last lecture. In that lecture, we identified the revolutionary change of scientific paradigms in the 20th century as further evidence of the extent and the depth of the traumatic forces at work in the cultural environment as a whole, making radical adaptation and mutation within the worldview of Western civilization an absolute and urgent necessity. Sartre's basic philosophical approach takes its point of departure from the phenomenological method that had been pioneered by Sartre's teacher, Edmund Husserl. Without the opportunity to develop the comparison in detail, it's important to note that the notion of phenomenology as the study of the dynamic structures of consciousness and human self-awareness posits a model of consciousness which bears an astonishingly close parallel to the model of physical reality proposed by relativity theory and quantum mechanics. To give just two brief examples, we can only touch on this, but it's a topic that it would be wonderful to be able to explore further, and certainly I hope that this will be stimulus for you to do that. First example, as Sartre views consciousness, it operates according to the same principle of complementarity that the physicists had identified as central to the quantum conception of reality. That is to say, complementarity. Under different circumstances, quantum reality can exhibit the characteristics of both wave phenomena and particle phenomena in such a way that neither set of characteristics, the characteristics of wave, the characteristics of particle, can be taken to be more basic, more fundamental, or more real than the other, despite, as we have seen, being incommensurable to one another. It's undecidable whether the quanta are in reality wave or particle. It's a matter not of truth, empirical truth in the classical sense, but rather now a probabilistic truth. In the same way, for Sartre, our conscious experience of the world is a constant exchange between two poles of awareness, the dynamic of subjectivity and the dynamic of objectivity. But neither of these two poles of consciousness and self-awareness has any meaning except in relation to the other, despite the fact that they define entirely different dynamics of experience. So in other words, without subjectivity, objectivity becomes meaningless, and vice versa. So in this sense, the notion of complementarity has to be closely linked both in physics and, in our suggestion, in phenomenology. The principle of complementarity needs to be closely linked to the uncertainty principle articulated by Heisenberg. Put in its simplest terms, the uncertainty principle stipulates that with regard to quantum phenomena, it will be impossible to determine precisely both the position and the momentum of a quantum of energy simultaneously. The relationship between the two will be undecidable in any definite terms. In other words, quantum mechanics leaves behind the conception of stasis, that is, any fixed or stable condition or situation to which the quality of real existence can be attributed. Existence doesn't stand still, ever. It cannot be fixed. All of the realities of the quantum worldview are, as we have seen, purely contextual and relational, not simply with regard to any of their particular characteristics, but with regard to their very existence and reality as such. Quantum phenomena are always probabilistic in their reality, and their meaning can never be fixed as enduring or stable. For Sartre, consciousness possesses the same relational and contextual structure as the quantum worldview, such that all of the strata of meaning, which are constituted within the dynamics of consciousness, See, his basic point here is that what we refer to as meaning is a process that occurs within consciousness. And it occurs complexly, not simply. Consciousness has to constitute layers of meaning until finally it's able to project itself and its experience into what could legitimately be called a world, so that it can have a world view. These dynamics of consciousness, therefore, can never be regarded as possessing stable, determinate, or independent existence apart from the experience of consciousness itself. Phenomenology rules out the question, what is real apart from consciousness and human experience? The view of a reality in itself. It rules out the question of the thing in itself and rules it out not just as unknowable, but as meaningless. Meaningless in the strictest technical sense of the word. This is not rhetoric to term it meaningless. It's rather a definition of reality and the possibility of reality within the structure of meaning. A so-called reality existing apart from possible human consciousness could have no possible meaning, because meaning is relation in this worldview, a relation to consciousness. It follows from this that to say of such a reality, a so-called reality, that might be considered as apart from consciousness, to say of such a reality that it exists or it does not exist, in both cases would be equally pointless, meaningless, in other words. So, the essential spirit of this Sartrean conception of the self clearly shows that far from being an abstract philosophical speculation, despite everything we have just been through, here's the point I want to iterate. Sartre's concern is the way this theory of consciousness, articulated through phenomenology, actually matches the experience of existing human beings, and existing human beings in a situation in which responsibility is the primary concern. Sartre's description of consciousness arose directly from the struggle for survival, waged by personal freedom in the face of totalitarianism. Let me read you a quotation from Jean-Paul Sartre's Republic of Silence about his wartime experience and the wartime experience of France and indeed Western Europe. Sartre says, "We were never freer than during the German occupation. We had lost all our rights, beginning with the right to talk. Every day we were insulted to our faces and had to take it in silence. Under one pretext or another, as workers, Jews, or political prisoners, we were deported en masse. And because of all of this, we were free. Because the Nazi venom seeped into our thoughts, every accurate thought was a conquest. Because an all-powerful police tried to force us to hold our tongues, every word took on the value of a declaration of principles. Because we were hunted down, every one of our gestures had the weight of a solemn commitment. Exile, captivity, and especially death, which we usually shrink from facing at all in happier days, became for us the habitual objects of our concern. We learned that they were neither inevitable accidents nor even constant and inevitable dangers, but they must be considered as our lot itself, our destiny, the profound source of our reality as men. At every instant, we lived up to the full sense of this commonplace little phrase, man is mortal. And the choice that each of us made of his life was an authentic choice because it was made face to face with death. Because it could always have been expressed in these terms, rather death than. And here, I'm not just speaking of the elite among us who were real résistants, but of all Frenchmen who, at every hour of the night and day, throughout 4 years, answered no. Obviously, a statement of extraordinary power. But we need to take responsibility for it as well. We need to ask, is Sartre really justified in extending this image of isolated humanity under the force of totalitarian oppression, extending it to represent the human condition as a whole? Yes, this occurs. It occurs from time to certain people. But is this what it means to be human? This is not a question that admits of either a categorical answer in principle, yes, he's right, no, he's wrong, or one that pretends to rest on the basis of empirical data. There can be no evidence with regard to a question like this. Sartre insists that, like all else that constitutes the horizon of our worldview, against which each encounter in the search for meaning must be profiled, the figure of the human person, what it means to be human, is itself a decision each one of us must make, the responsibility for which each one must bear alone. This is not a denial of the realities of community, of human interpersonal relationship. It's a question of the dynamics of responsibility. This total responsibility for humanity as a whole helps us to understand the real basis for Sartre's notorious atheism. The rejection of God as an ultimate court of appeal for decisions about what properly constitutes the human is a necessary condition of the assertion of human freedom as totally responsible for the meaning that one claims to find in human existence or not to find. Pause over this for just a moment to make sure we're clear about the full impact of this. I think there's a sense in which we immediately recognize that if one posits that the goal for human freedom is to take full responsibility for itself, then there is a sense in which any conception of a God, a divine being, whether personal or impersonal, that sets the pattern for reality, independent of human choice, is going to make it impossible for human existence to take total responsibility for itself. But is that a legitimate goal? Total responsibility. Notice, it's not total responsibility for this or that situation, this or that choice or action. It's total responsibility for identity, for the identity of one's life project and the meaning one posits for it. But if human freedom is not capable, somewhere, somehow, of full and genuine responsibility, then what point is there to talking about responsibility at all? If we can criticize ourselves or others for not taking responsibilities for the problems of violence, for the problems of economic violence, social violence, racial violence, gender violence, if we cannot hold ourselves responsible at some fundamental level which is genuinely our own, what is the point of asking for responsibility at all? Now, this conception of the self points us toward not only the center of Sartre's thought, but also toward what lies at the center of the figure of the hero. The premise that we're tacitly operating on in this lecture up to this point has been Sartre presents us with the fully evolved and pressed to its extremity image of the hero under the peculiar and unique conditions of 20th century totalitarian violence. The hero for Sartre is the person, as it was in the beginning that we traced the origin of the image of the hero with the Greek culture. The hero is the person of self-knowledge and self-mastery, who knows that he is nothing except what he achieves, and the one who takes total responsibility for the achievement of an identity through choice, action, and commitment. A pattern of action which constitutes the only meaning that human existence can have, because it exists in a worldview which is fundamentally indifferent to that existence. Ironically, Sartre claims that this isolated self, which arises from the original choice to say no to the absolute otherness of all that is not the self, is the only basis for an authentically affirmative humanism. And here, just a reminder of the relationship of Sartre's humanism born of no-saying to that affirmation of heroic identity, that affirmation of humanism that we find in Nietzsche articulated precisely as being a yes-sayer. The yes and the no play across the question which both Sartre and Nietzsche share. As a way of drawing our reflections on existentialism, French existentialism, toward a conclusion, at least a temporary stopping point, I want to turn for the time that remains to the character of Simone de Beauvoir, who, along with Sartre, was at the center of the French existentialist movement during and after World War II. From their time at the university, these two, Sartre and de Beauvoir, were life companions and both encouraged and criticized one another's work. De Beauvoir shared Sartre's conception of human freedom as being originally nothing except the possibility of responsibility, and recognized in consciousness a kind of impersonal spontaneity, which was without identity of its own, but which was driven by and as desire. It was nothing except insofar as it differentiated itself from everything which was not itself and related to it as the object of its desire. Like Sartre, she asserted that human identity began originally with this act of negation, saying no, of saying no to the other, thereby asserting and maintaining itself as free, undetermined by any relationship or any meaning structure except its own freedom, and therefore as capable of taking total responsibility for its own identity. It's from this perspective of freedom's necessary rejection of otherness that Simone de Beauvoir begins her epoch-making deconstruction of the history of patriarchy in the West. In 1949, she published her best-known philosophical work, The Second Sex. And although it ranges broadly across history and comparative cultural and social issues, at its core, the book's analysis rests on three basic premises. The first comes directly from Sartre's analysis of consciousness. It asserts that the opposition of the subject of consciousness and whatever is different from consciousness, whatever is its object, is its most basic and universally necessary structure. To exist as a person, as a subject, is to exist through differentiation of that subjectivity from all that is other than subjectivity. Second, gender identification, de Beauvoir argues, has historically functioned, especially in Western civilization, as the most powerful manifestation of this necessary structure of self-consciousness as freedom, the need to differentiate itself from the other by negation, by saying no to the other. woman, de Beauvoir argues, is the original other of the Western cultural tradition, the original object of the necessary dynamic of consciousness to negate, and in negating to differentiate and establish itself. Third, while gender identity and differentiation is biologically conditioned, de Beauvoir argues, it is not biologically determined. Rather, gender is a meaning construct, which is the result of the dynamics of human choice, both individual and cultural. Patriarchal oppression of women by men is not a deterministic structure of consciousness as free. It is, however, shaped by instinctual biological drives which must first be recognized and accepted as subject to choice before they can be responsibly mediated within human identity. Beauvoir offers no specific program to restructure gender identity. Her work stands at the beginning of contemporary feminist thought, not just in a historical sense, but in a philosophical sense as well. She identifies the need to liberate conscious awareness from the oppression of patriarchal societal structures as one critical component of the more general need to reassert the identity of the hero as perennially indispensable to human existence. She raises the possibility of there being a genuinely feminine image of the hero, a genuine and authentic heroine. She transfers, in other words, Sartre's call for total responsibility to one of the most concentrated pockets of violence in the totalitarian environment of the 20th century.